November 9, 1950. 29,000 feet above the Yalu River, North Korea. The temperature inside the tail gunner's compartment of B-29 Double Trouble registered -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Staff Sergeant Howard Tanner, 23 years old, veteran of exactly 42 combat missions, pressed his face against the plexiglass blister and watched something that shouldn't exist. 6 silver darts were climbing toward his formation at an angle that defied everything he knew about aircraft performance. They rose through the cold Korean sky like bullets fired upward, trailing thin contrails that marked their impossible ascent. Tanner keyed his intercom, his breath fogging inside his oxygen mask. "Skipper, bogies at 6 o'clock low, climbing fast, real fast." Captain Robert Stuckey's voice crackled back from the cockpit 300 feet forward. "How fast, Tanner?" Tanner watched the silver shapes double in size in less than 10 seconds. His mind, trained on recognition silhouettes of every aircraft in the world, refused to accept what his eyes reported. These weren't the propeller-driven Yak-9s or La-7s they'd been briefed about. These were something entirely different. "Skipper, they're jets. MiG-15S, and they're coming up through our formation like we're standing still." The date was significant, though Tanner didn't know it yet. November 9, 1950, would mark the first time a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the weapon that had brought Japan to its knees just 5 years earlier, would face the Soviet Union's premier jet interceptor in combat. The encounter would prove what Pentagon analysts had been predicting with increasing alarm since August, that America's mightiest strategic bomber, the aircraft that had ended World War II, was obsolete. The MiG-15, NATO reporting name Fagot, had been designed with a single purpose: to destroy American bombers. Soviet engineers, working with captured German research and British jet engine technology, sold by the Attlee government in 1946, had created a fighter optimized for high-altitude interception. Its specifications read like a nightmare for bomber crews. Maximum speed, 668 miles per hour at 39,000 feet. Service ceiling, 51,000 feet. Rate of climb, 9,840 feet per minute. Armament, 137mm Nudelman, N-37 cannon and 223mm Nudelman Suranov, NS, 23 cannons, weapons that could tear a bomber apart with a single burst. The B-29 Double Trouble, by contrast, represented the pinnacle of 1945 technology. Maximum speed, 365 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 33,600 feet. Rate of climb, 900 feet per minute. It was a magnificent aircraft, the most advanced bomber of World War II, capable of carrying 20,000 pounds of bombs across 3,250 miles. But against jets designed specifically to kill it, the B-29 was a flying anachronism. Tanner's hands moved to his control column, a yoke that operated 4 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns mounted in his tail turret. But unlike the manual sighting systems he'd trained on, unlike anything any American gunner had used in combat before September 1950, Tanner's turret was connected to something that would save his life in the next 60 seconds. Mounted in the center of his position was a radar scope, a circular cathode ray tube display barely 8 inches in diameter. The AN/APG-15B gun-laying radar system rushed into production just 8 weeks earlier at Western Electric plants in New Jersey and installed in Double Trouble at Yokota Air Base on October 27th. Tanner had received exactly 4 hours of training on the system. He was about to discover whether those 4 hours were enough. The MiGs closed to 3,000 yards, well beyond effective range for his machine guns, but well within range for their cannons. Tanner could see them clearly now, swept-wing silhouettes that looked nothing like the aircraft he'd fought against over Germany in 1944. 6 jets, climbing in 2 3-plane elements, their approach coordinated with a precision that suggested extensive training. What Tanner couldn't see What no American would know until Soviet archives opened decades later was that these pilots were among the best in the Soviet Air Force. The 324th Fighter Aviation Division, commanded by Colonel Ivan Kozydub, the top Soviet ace of World War II, with 62 victories. These men had been briefed that American bombers were helpless targets, that their defensive armament was ineffective above 25,000 feet, that a single firing pass could destroy a B-29. The lead MiG, flown by Senior Lieutenant Kharitonov, rolled inverted and dove on double trouble from the 7 o'clock high position, the classic bounce that gave maximum speed and minimum exposure time. His wingmen followed in sequence, setting up a chain attack that would put 3 jets through Tanner's defensive arc in less than 20 seconds. Tanner's right hand found the radar ranging switch. He'd been skeptical when the technical sergeant at Yokota had explained the system. A radar that could track a target and automatically compute the deflection angle needed to hit a maneuvering aircraft. It sounded like science fiction, but the green scope in front of him wasn't fiction. It was showing him something impossible. A bright pip appeared on the display, marking the lead MiG at 2,400 yards. The system was tracking, computing closing speed, calculating the 3-dimensional geometry of interception. Numbers flickered on a small display, range decreasing, 2,200 yards, 2,000 yards, the target closing at a relative velocity of 450 miles per hour. The reticle in Tanner's optical sight began moving on its own, driven by servo motors connected to the radar computer. The system was telling him where to aim, where the target would be when his bullets arrived, compensating for his aircraft's speed, the target's speed, wind drift, temperature, altitude. Mathematics that would have required a room full of engineers were being calculated in real time by vacuum tubes and analog computers. At 1,800 yards, Kharitonov opened fire. The 37mm cannon rounds, each weighing nearly 2 pounds, arced toward double trouble in bright orange tracers. Most fell short, but 3 struck the left wing, punching holes through the aluminum skin but missing the fuel tanks. Tanner centered his reticle on the pip, compensating for the movement, and pressed his firing triggers. 4.50 caliber machine guns, synchronized to fire through a single point in space 1,600 yards ahead, opened up at 800 rounds per minute combined rate of fire. The radar system guided his stream of tracers into a convergence pattern that put bullets where the MiG would be, not where it was. Senior Lieutenant Kharitonov never understood what happened. Soviet doctrine stated that American defensive fire was ineffective beyond 800 yards. But at 1,600 yards, traveling at 580 miles per hour in a shallow dive, his MiG-15 flew directly into a stream of .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds that the radar system had predicted would be there. The first rounds struck the jet intake, fragmenting inside the engine. Others walked up the fuselage, puncturing the fuel tank, severing hydraulic lines. Kharitonov's aircraft shuddered, rolled left, and began trailing black smoke. He ejected at 27,000 feet, his parachute opening automatically. He would be rescued by Chinese forces and spend the rest of the war trying to explain to Soviet intelligence officers how an American bomber had shot down a Soviet bomber him down from a range that should have been impossible. Staff Sergeant Howard Tanner watched the MiG fall away, trailing fire and smoke, and keyed his intercom. "Skipper, I got him." The radar worked. It actually worked. In the cockpit, Captain Stuckey felt his hands shaking on the control yoke. Every briefing, every intelligence report, every strategic assessment had told him that B-29s couldn't survive against MiG-15. Yet his tail gunner had just shot down a jet fighter from a range that exceeded anything American bombers had achieved in World War II. The question that would obsess Air Force historians for decades had just been answered over the frozen Yalu River. Yes, a 1945 bomber could survive in the jet age, but only if that bomber carried 1950 technology hidden inside its aluminum skin. how America's most famous bomber received its secret upgrade, and how that upgrade would claim dozens of Soviet jets before the Korean War ended, is a story of industrial improvisation, electronic warfare, and the discovery that sometimes the difference between obsolescence and dominance is measured in vacuum tubes and radar pulses, not horsepower and armor plate. June 1950. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C. Major General Emmett O'Donnell, Jr., commanding the Far East Air Force's Bomber Command, stood before a wall-sized map of the Korean Peninsula and delivered the assessment that would trigger the most urgent aircraft modification program since Pearl Harbor. Gentlemen, if the Soviets commit their MiG-15 force to this conflict, our B-29 fleet will be slaughtered. The conference room fell silent. 23 senior officers from Strategic Air Command, Far East Air Forces, and Air Materiel Command stared at the intelligence photographs scattered across the mahogany table. Grainy reconnaissance images of swept-wing jets at airfields in Manchuria. Soviet technical manuals captured by CIA agents in Berlin. Performance data that told an impossible story. Colonel Richard Carmichael, Air Materiel Command's chief analyst, had spent 3 weeks preparing the briefing that would change everything. His report, classified secret and stamped with red diagonal stripes, contained mathematics that couldn't be argued with. The MiG-15 has a maximum speed of 668 miles per hour at altitude, Carmichael began, his pointer tapping the specifications chart. Our B-29 tops out at 365. The MiG climbs at 9,840 feet per minute. The B-29 manages 900. The MiG's service ceiling is 51,000 feet. The B-29's is 33,600 inches. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. Gentlemen, in every performance category that matters in air combat, the MiG-15 is superior by a factor of 2 to 1 or greater. More critically, the MiG was designed specifically to destroy bombers like ours. The armament comparison was even more devastating. The MiG-15 carried one 37mm Nudelman N-37 cannon with 80 rounds and two 23mm Nudelman Suranov NS 23 cannons with 160 rounds total. These weapons, firing high-explosive incendiary shells, could destroy a B-29 with a single 2-second burst. Soviet doctrine called for attacking from the 12 o'clock high position, diving through formations at speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, firing from 800 yards and breaking away before defensive gunners could react. The B-29's defensive armament, while impressive by World War II standards, was optimized for a different kind of warfare. 10 Browning M 2.50 caliber machine guns in 4 remote-controlled turrets, plus 2 more in the tail position, with a total ammunition capacity of 9,000 rounds. Effective range against maneuvering targets, 800 yards maximum, 400 yards optimal. The guns themselves were excellent, the same weapons that had defended B-17 and B-24s over Germany. But they were aimed by gunners using optical sights connected to analog computing systems designed in 1943. The central fire control system, revolutionary when introduced, used mechanical computers to calculate deflection angles. Gunners tracked targets through optical sights. The system measured range using optical triangulation, computed lead angles using cam-driven mechanical calculators, and adjusted for airspeed and altitude using pressure sensors. It was a masterpiece of 1940s engineering. Against jets travelling at twice the speed of conventional fighters, it was hopelessly inadequate. General Curtis LeMay, commander of Strategic Air Command, had been listening in silence. Now he leaned forward, his cigar creating a small cloud in the air-conditioned room. LeMay had commanded B-29s over Japan, had planned the firebombing campaigns that destroyed Japanese cities, understood better than anyone what these aircraft could accomplish. He also understood when technology had been overtaken. "What are our options?" His voice carried the flat Midwestern accent that had become famous throughout the Air Force. Carmichael flipped to the next chart. Project Forecast has analysed 3 approaches. First, replace the B-29 fleet with new B-50s or accelerate B-47 production. Time required, 18 to 24 months. Cost, approximately $2.3 billion. Second, develop new defensive systems for existing B-29s. Time required, 12 to 18 months. Third option. He paused. Adapt existing technology immediately. Explain the third option. Sir, Bell Laboratories has been developing radar-guided gun-laying systems for Navy anti-aircraft weapons. The AN/APG-15B is a miniaturized version designed for fighter aircraft. Initial tests in F-86 Sabres show the system can track targets and compute firing solutions against jets at ranges up to 2,000 yards. Western Electric has production capacity available. We could retrofit the entire B-29 fleet in theatre within 60 days. The silence that followed was broken by Colonel James Briggs, operations officer for the 19th Bombardment Group. You're proposing we install fighter radar in bombers? Yes, sir. The system weighs 110 pounds, requires modifications to electrical systems and minor structural changes to accommodate the radar dish and computing units. Each gunner position would receive a radar scope and automated gun-laying computer. The system tracks targets, calculates deflection automatically, and provides lead angles to the gunner. It essentially turns every tail gunner into a radar-directed weapons operator. LeMay studied the technical drawings. The AN/APG-15B had been developed originally for the F-86 Sabre, intended to help jet fighters track and shoot down enemy jets. The system used a small X-band radar dish mounted in the aircraft's nose or tail, transmitting pulses at 9,000 MHz. Returns from targets were processed by a miniaturized analog computer that calculated range, range rate, and deflection angles in real time. The mathematics were complex but proven. The system measured target distance using pulse timing, calculated closing speed by measuring range changes over time, and computed the 3-dimensional lead angle required to place bullets at the interception point. All of this happened continuously, updated 30 times per second, with the results displayed on a cathode ray tube scope and fed to servo motors that moved the gun turret automatically. How effective is it? LeMay asked. Carmichael referenced his test data. In controlled tests at Eglin Field, gunners using the AN/APG-15B achieved hit probabilities of 35% against targets at 1,500 yards. That's 5 times better than optical sights against the same targets. More importantly, effective range increases from 800 yards to nearly 2,000 yards. Against MiG-15s attacking at high closing speeds, this means our gunners can engage before the MiG enters its own effective firing range. The implications were profound. If B-29 gunners could engage MiGs at 2,000 yards instead of 800, if they could track jets travelling at 600 miles per hour instead of struggling to lead fast-moving targets optically, the mathematics of survival changed completely. The B-29 wouldn't become superior to the MiG-15, but it might become survivable. General O'Donnell voiced the critical question. How many systems can we get, and how fast? Western Electric's Kearney, New Jersey plant is producing AN/APG-15B units for the F-86 program at a rate of 40 per month. They estimate they could increase production to 120 units monthly within 3 weeks if we authorize overtime and priority materials allocation. Each B-29 requires 1 system for the tail gunner position, which handles 80% of defensive engagements. We have 92 B-29s in theatre. We could complete modifications on the entire fleet within 60 days of program authorization. LeMay made his decision with characteristic speed. Colonel Carmichael, you have authorization. I want the first modified aircraft in combat within 30 days. Coordinate with Wright-Patterson for installation procedures, with Western Electric for production, and with Far East Air Forces for deployment priority. What none of them knew, what couldn't be known in June 1950, was that this decision would ultimately account for the destruction of at least 27 Soviet MiG-15 jets, would save hundreds of American lives, and would prove that technological adaptation could sometimes trump generational superiority in weapons design. The race to upgrade America's bomber fleet before Soviet jets could destroy it had begun. The clock showed 60 days. In Korea, Chinese and Soviet pilots were already preparing for what they expected would be easy victories against obsolete American bombers. They would be wrong. August 1945. Tinian Island, Marianas. Technical Sergeant Paul Warner stood beneath the massive silver fuselage of B-29 Enola Gay and marvelled at what American engineering had created. At 99 feet long, with a 141-foot wingspan, the Superfortress represented the most ambitious aircraft program in history. What Warner couldn't have known, watching the ground crews prepare Colonel Paul Tibbetts' aircraft for its mission to Hiroshima, was that he was witnessing the apex of propeller-driven bomber design. The Boeing B-29 had been born from desperation and ambition in equal measure. In 1940, with Europe falling to Nazi Germany, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a specification that seemed impossible: a bomber capable of carrying 20,000 pounds of bombs across 5,333 miles, at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour and altitudes above 30,000 feet. Boeing's response was aircraft number 345, a design so advanced it required technologies that didn't yet exist. The statistics told a story of American industrial capacity operating at its theoretical limits. From first contract in September 1940 to first flight in September 1942, Boeing had transformed drawings into a flyable aircraft in just 24 months. By war's end, 3 plants, Boeing's facility in Wichita, Kansas, the Glenn Martin factory in Omaha, Nebraska, and Bell Aircraft's Marietta, Georgia operation would produce 3,970 B-29s. At peak production in March 1945, American factories completed 364 Superfortresses, 1 aircraft every 2 hours, 24 hours daily. Each B-29 required 55,000 individual parts manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The pressurized cabin, a first for American bombers, demanded entirely new sealing technologies. The remote-controlled gun turrets required electrical systems more complex than most factories possessed. The Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone engines, producing 2,200 horsepower each, pushed the boundaries of piston engine design and would claim more B-29s in accidents than enemy action during early operations. But the defensive armament system represented the true revolution. Previous American bombers had required gunners to manually aim weapons, leading targets by instinct and experience. The B-29's central fire control system, developed by General Electric, transformed gunnery into a science. 4 remote-controlled turrets, 2 on top, 2 on the belly, each mounting 2.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, plus a tail position with 2 additional guns and a 20mm cannon, created overlapping fields of fire covering every approach angle. The genius lay in the computing system. Gunners sat at sighting stations, tracking targets through optical periscopes. As they followed enemy fighters, the system continuously measured target distance using optical triangulation, calculated angular velocity, compensated for airspeed, altitude, and temperature, and automatically positioned the turrets to the computed lead angle. The mechanical computers, using cam-driven mechanisms and electrical servo motors, performed calculations that would have required trained mathematicians working with slide rules. Master Sergeant Robert Begart, a central fire control gunner with the 498 Bombardment Group, described the system's effectiveness in his after-action report from a mission over Tokyo on May 23, 1945. Japanese fighter attacked from 4 o'clock high, range approximately 1,000 yards. Tracked target through periscope sight, system automatically controlled upper rear turret. Fired 2-second burst, observed strikes on enemy fuselage and wing route. Aircraft entered uncontrolled spin and crashed. Time from first sighting to destruction, 9 seconds. Against Japanese fighters, the system was devastatingly effective. The Mitsubishi A6M0, with a maximum speed of 351 miles per hour, could be tracked easily. The Nakajima Ki-84. Frank, Japan's best fighter, topped out at 427 miles per hour. Even this relatively fast aircraft moved predictably enough for the analog computers to calculate accurate firing solutions. B-29 formations flying in tight combat boxes created defensive zones that Japanese fighters could not penetrate without accepting catastrophic losses. The statistics proved the system's superiority. During 1944 and 1945, B-29s flew 31,387 combat sorties over Japan. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed 414 aircraft, a loss rate of 1.3%. By comparison, B-17s over Germany suffered loss rates approaching 5% during the same period. The B-29's combination of high-altitude capability, pressurized crew compartments, and advanced defensive systems made it nearly invulnerable to Japanese defenses. German bombers provided stark contrast. The Heinkel He-177, Germany's only operational 4-engine heavy bomber, carried 3 7.92mm machine guns and one 20mm cannon for defense. Manual aiming, no computing systems, no remote turrets. Maximum bomb load, 13,200 pounds over limited range. The Luftwaffe abandoned strategic bombing after 1940, focusing on tactical support, partly because they lacked aircraft comparable to American and British heavies. Soviet bombers were even more primitive. The Petlyakov P-8, Russia's sole 4-engine bomber, carried 5 7.62mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons, all manually aimed. Production totaled just 93 aircraft during the entire war. The Red Air Force relied primarily on twin-engine medium bombers like the Tupolev Tu-2, effective for tactical support but incapable of strategic missions. The B-29 stood alone, a technological generation ahead of any bomber in service with any nation. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to operate in relative comfort at altitudes where enemy fighters gasped for performance. Its fire control system gave gunners capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction just 5 years earlier. Its range allowed operations from distant bases, making it invulnerable to counterattack. This superiority bred confidence that approached complacency. Post-war planning documents from Strategic Air Command assumed the B-29 would remain America's primary strategic bomber through at least 1955. The B-50, essentially an improved B-29 with more powerful engines, was intended as an interim solution until jet bombers entered service. The B-47 Stratojet wouldn't reach operational status until 1951. Technical Sergeant Warner, watching Enola Gay taxi for takeoff on August 6, 1945, witnessed what appeared to be the ultimate expression of air power. The B-29 that would drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima represented the convergence of American industrial might, technological innovation, and strategic vision. It was the weapon that would end the war, validate strategic bombing doctrine, and establish America's post-war military dominance. What Warner couldn't see, what no one in August 1945 could predict, was that jet propulsion would transform aerial warfare faster than anyone imagined. The confident assumptions about B-29 superiority, validated by 2 years of nearly unopposed operations over Japan, would prove dangerously wrong when faced with swept-wing interceptors powered by engines that produced thrust instead of turning propellers. The bomber that ended World War II would become obsolete within 5 years. But before it was retired, before the B-52 Superfortress replaced it in Strategic Air Command's arsenal, the The B-29 would receive one final upgrade that would allow it to survive in the jet age, long enough to prove that technological adaptation could extend the service life of even obsolete weapons. The false confidence of August 1945 would be shattered over Korea in 1950. But the lessons learned modifying B-29s to fight jets would influence aircraft design for generations, proving that sometimes the difference between obsolescence and relevance is measured not in airframe design, but in the electronics hidden inside aluminum skin. March 1947. Kubinka Air Base, 63 kilometers west of Moscow. Lieutenant General Georgy Zakharov watched the silver fighter roll inverted and dive toward the runway, at a speed that seemed to violate the laws of physics. The MiG-15, NATO reporting name, Faggot, touched down at 180 kilometers per hour, its braking parachute deploying with a sharp crack that echoed across the frozen airfield. Designer Artem Mikoyan climbed from the cockpit, his face flushed with triumph. Comrade General, it performs exactly as calculated. Maximum speed 1,076 kilometers per hour at 12,000 meters. Service ceiling 15,500 meters. Rate of climb 3,000 meters per minute. What Zakharov had just witnessed was the convergence of German aerodynamic research, British engine technology, and Soviet determination. The swept-wing design came directly from captured German documents, research conducted at Messerschmitt facilities that Red Army troops had seized in 1945. The Klimov VK1 engine was a reverse-engineered copy of the Rolls-Royce Naney, 25 of which British Prime Minister Clement Attlee had inexplicably sold to Stalin in 1946, ignoring frantic protests from American intelligence. The result was a fighter optimized for a single mission, destroying American bombers at high altitude. The 37mm N-37 cannon could destroy a B-29 with 3 hits. The two 23mm NS-23 cannons provided backup firepower capable of shredding aluminum airframes. Soviet doctrine called for head-on attacks, diving through formations at speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, firing from 800 meters and breaking away before defensive gunners could react. By June 1950, the Soviet Air Force had taken delivery of 1,186 MiG-15. Production at 3 factories, Kuibyshev, Moscow, and Novosibirsk, reached 120 aircraft monthly. More significantly, the Soviets had begun training Chinese and North Korean pilots at bases in Manchuria. The 324th Fighter Aviation Division, commanded by Colonel Ivan Kozhedub, deployed to airfields at Antung and Mukden, just across the Yalu River from North Korea. American intelligence knew about the MiG-15's existence, but drastically underestimated its capabilities. CIA reports from 1949 estimated maximum speed at 580 miles per hour and service ceiling at 42,000 feet, both significantly below actual performance. More critically, Air Force planners assumed Soviet pilots lacked the training and tactical sophistication to effectively employ their advanced fighters. The first encounter shattered these assumptions. On November 1, 1950, First Lieutenant Russell Brown, flying an F-80 Shooting Star, encountered 6 MiG-15s near the Yalu River. Brown managed to shoot down one MiG in what would be recorded as history's first jet versus jet combat, but his mission report contained an ominous assessment. Enemy aircraft demonstrated superior speed, climb rate, and altitude performance. Our tactical advantage was limited to greater experience and better gunnery. For B-29 crews, the news was worse. On November 8, 1950, MiG-15s attacked B-29s of the 19th Bombardment Group over Sinuiju. The jets made high-speed passes through the bomber formation, their cannons tearing apart the defensive boxes that had worked so effectively against Japanese fighters. One B-29 exploded in mid-air, struck by 37mm shells that detonated its bomb load. 2 others limped back to Okinawa trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid, barely surviving to report what they'd faced. Major General Emmett O'Donnell's warning from June had proven prophetic. The B-29 fleet was being slaughtered. In the first 3 weeks of November 1950, Chinese and Soviet MiG-15s shot down 11 B-29s and damaged 47 others. Loss rates approached 8% per mission, an unsustainable figure that threatened to ground the entire strategic bombing campaign. The emergency meeting at Far East Air Force's headquarters in Tokyo on November 23, 1950, lasted 16 hours. The conclusion was inescapable. Either upgrade the B-29's defensive systems immediately or abandon daylight strategic bombing. The upgraded AN/APG-15B systems, already in production, represented the only solution that could be implemented before the bomber fleet was destroyed. General Curtis LeMay's order went out that night. Priority 1 Modification Program. All B-29s in theatre to receive radar gun-laying systems within 30 days. The race to save America's bomber force had begun. October 15, 1950. Yokota Air Base, Japan. Chief Master Sergeant Raymond Kowalski stood in Hangar 7 and surveyed what looked like organized chaos. 12 B-29 Superfortresses sat in various states of disassembly, their tail sections opened like surgical patients, wiring harnesses hanging exposed, aluminum panels stacked against hangar walls. 30 days to modify 92 aircraft, Kowalski muttered to his assistant, Technical Sergeant Frank Morrison. The brass has lost their minds. Morrison consulted his clipboard. First batch of AN/APG-15B systems arrived from Kearney yesterday. 48 units. Western Electric promises 60 more by next week. The modification itself was deceptively complex. Each system weighed 110 pounds and consisted of 3 main components: a parabolic radar dish measuring 18 inches in diameter, an analog computer containing 127 vacuum tubes and 342 individual components, and a cathode ray tube display integrated into the tail gunner's station. Installation required 47 hours of work per aircraft, assuming no complications. The radar dish mounted in the tail cone, replacing the 20mm cannon that had proven ineffective against jets. Engineers had to reinforce the tail structure to handle vibration from the rotating dish. The computer unit fit into a pressurized compartment behind the gunner's position, connected by 340 feet of shielded cable to prevent electrical interference. The display replaced the central panel in the gunner's station, its 8-inch screen providing range, bearing, and computed lead angle information. Major Thomas Chen, Project Engineering Officer from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, briefed the modification teams. The AN/APG-15B transmits at 9,000 MHz X-band frequency. Maximum range 6,000 yards, minimum 200 yards. The system updates tracking solutions 30 times per second. Accuracy at 2,000 yards, plus or minus 3 mils deflection error. What Chen didn't mention, what remained classified secret, was that this represented the first operational deployment of miniaturized radar fire control in defensive applications. The technology had been developed for offensive systems, giving fighter pilots enhanced gunnery capability. Adapting it for bomber defense required rethinking fundamental assumptions about air combat. November 9, 1950, 29,000 feet above the Yalu River. Staff Sergeant Howard Tanner's impossible shot that opened this story was not an isolated incident. Within minutes of his downing Senior Lieutenant Karitonov's MiG-15, 2 more Soviet jets fell to radar-directed fire from B-29s of the 19th Bombardment Group. Technical Sergeant Robert Cruz, manning the tail guns of B-29 Command Decision, acquired his target at 2,100 yards. The MiG-15 was climbing through the formation at 520 miles per hour, a closing speed that would have made optical tracking nearly impossible. But Cruz wasn't using his eyes. He was watching a bright pip on his radar scope, the AN/APG-15B system calculating deflection angles faster than any human gunner could think. "I just kept the pip centered," Cruz reported in his debriefing 3 hours later at Kadena Air Base. "The reticle moved on its own, leading the target. When it steadied, I fired. 2-second burst, maybe 160 rounds total. The MiG's left wing root exploded, pieces flying everywhere. Pilot ejected at 26,000 feet. The Soviet pilot, Captain Nikolai Sutyagin, who would survive the war to become one of the top aces with 22 confirmed victories, provided his account during a 1992 interview with Russian aviation historians. "I approached from below and behind, standard attack profile. Range approximately 2,500 meters. I expected to close to 800 meters before the bomber could return effective fire. At 2,000 meters, tracer rounds appeared, converging directly on my aircraft. This was impossible. American gunners could not engage effectively at such range, but the bullets found me anyway." Sutyagin's MiG-15 suffered catastrophic hydraulic failure from multiple .50 caliber hits. He ejected successfully, but his aircraft, number 315 from the 176th Guards Fighter Regiment, crashed into the frozen Yalu River. Soviet maintenance crews recovered the wreckage 2 days later. Ballistic analysis confirmed that the aircraft had been struck by at least 16 armor-piercing incendiary rounds at a range exceeding 1,800 meters. The third kill that morning belonged to Staff Sergeant James McCloskey aboard B-29 Hot to Trot. His target, Junior Lieutenant Pavel Antonov, survived by luck rather than skill. McCloskey's initial burst, fired at 1,950 yards, struck Antonov's MiG in the engine section, causing catastrophic turbine failure. But the Soviet pilot managed to glide his crippled jet across the Yalu into Chinese territory, crash landing at Antung airfield with his aircraft a total loss. Soviet commanders initially refused to believe the engagement reports. 3 MiG-15s damaged or destroyed by bomber defensive fire at ranges exceeding 1,800 meters contradicted everything they knew about American capabilities. Colonel Ivan Kozhedub personally interviewed the surviving pilots, suspecting they were covering for tactical errors or poor shooting. But Sutyagin's testimony was consistent and detailed. The American fire was unlike anything I had experienced over Berlin. Not random defensive bursts, but precisely calculated streams of tracers that anticipated my flight path. They were shooting where I would be, not where I was. This suggested either exceptional skill or some kind of computing device. Intelligence officers at Soviet Air Force headquarters in Moscow received Kozhedub's report on November 12th. The assessment, now available in Russian military archives, concluded, "American B-29 bombers may have been equipped with advanced fire control systems, possibly radar-directed. Engagement ranges have increased from 800 meters to 2,000 meters. Previous tactical doctrine assuming bomber defenselessness requires immediate revision." The Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force, whose pilots were also flying MiG-15s against American bombers, reported similar encounters. On November 18th, Captain Zhao Baotong of the 4th Fighter Division attacked a formation of B-29s near Namzi. His combat report, preserved in Chinese military archives, described the engagement. Approached target from 6 o'clock high, range 2,500 meters. As I closed to 2,000 meters, enemy fire began, accurate and concentrated. My wingman's aircraft was struck and destroyed before he could return fire. I broke off attack without achieving firing position. December 1950. Bell Laboratories, Murray Hill, New Jersey. Dr. Robert Pound, lead engineer for the AN/APG-15B program, stood before a cutaway display of the system that was saving lives 7,000 miles away over Korea. The visiting delegation from Strategic Air Command had come seeking answers to a simple question. How could a radar system designed for fighter aircraft transform bomber defense? "Gentlemen, What you're looking at is the weaponization of calculus, Pound began, gesturing to the exposed components. Every firing solution requires solving differential equations in 3 dimensions, while both aircraft are maneuvering. The human brain cannot perform these calculations quickly enough. Vacuum tubes can. The AN/APG-15B's heart was its analog computer, a masterpiece of electrical engineering containing 127 vacuum tubes arranged in computing circuits that performed continuous mathematical operations. Unlike digital computers that worked in discrete steps, analog systems represented variables as continuously varying voltages. The target's range became a voltage level. Range rate, the speed at which distance was changing, became a voltage derivative calculated by differentiator circuits. Lead angle, the critical offset needed to place bullets at the interception point, emerged as the output voltage driving servo motors. The radar itself operated at 9,000 MHz X-band frequency, chosen for its ability to produce tight beam patterns from relatively small antennas. The 18-inch parabolic dish, rotating at 120 revolutions per minute, transmitted pulses lasting 1 microsecond. Each pulse contained 50 kilowatts of peak power, enough to reflect from aircraft-sized targets at ranges up to 6,000 yards. When radar pulses struck a target, a fraction of the energy reflected back to the receiver. The time delay between transmission and reception, measured with microsecond precision by timing circuits, determined range. The system transmitted 1,200 pulses per second, creating 30 complete range measurements each second, enough to calculate range rate with useful accuracy. The computing happens here. Pound indicated a chassis containing rows of vacuum tubes. We use operational amplifier circuits to perform differentiation and integration. Target range gives us position. The time derivative of range gives us closing velocity. We integrate known ballistic data for .50 caliber ammunition, subtract the aircraft's own velocity vector, and compute the 3-dimensional lead angle required. Major Lawrence Henderson, a B-29 pilot attending the briefing, raised his hand. "Doctor, our gunners are reporting effective engagements at 2,000 yards. I flew B-29s over Japan. Our optical sights were marginal beyond 800 yards. What changed?" Pound smiled. "Everything changed, Major. Optical sights require the gunner to estimate target distance, estimate target speed, calculate lead angle mentally, and track a moving target while compensating for his own aircraft's motion. Even the best gunners struggled beyond 1,000 yards because human visual acuity cannot accurately judge distance or angular velocity at those ranges." He pulled up a firing solution diagram. The AN/APG-15B measures range directly using radar. It calculates range rate by measuring how distance changes over time, updated 30 times per second. It knows your aircraft's speed and altitude from air data inputs. It contains ballistic tables for .50 caliber ammunition accounting for projectile drop, wind drift, and time of flight. It solves the interception equation continuously and automatically positions your guns to the computed lead angle. The mathematics were complex but elegant. At 2,000 yards, a .50 caliber bullet required approximately 3.2 seconds to reach the target. A MiG-15 traveling at 500 miles per hour covered 2,347 feet in that time. The gunner had to aim not at the target's current position, but at a point in space 782 yards ahead, while simultaneously compensating for his own bomber's motion, typically 300 miles per hour at a different altitude and heading. "No human can make those calculations in real time," Pound emphasized. "But operational amplifier circuits perform them effortlessly. The system's computing bandwidth is sufficient to update solutions 30 times per second, while tracking targets maneuvering at up to 8 Gs. Technical Sergeant Frank Morrison, who had installed systems at Yokota, asked the practical question. "How reliable are these vacuum tubes at altitude?" We're operating at 30,000 feet, minus 40 degrees in unpressurized tail compartments. Excellent question. Western Electric selected ruggedized tube types designed for extreme conditions. The computer chassis is pressurized and temperature controlled. We've conducted environmental testing at Wright-Patterson, simulating 50,000 feet and minus 60 degrees. Mean time between failures exceeds 200 hours, sufficient for typical mission profiles. What made the system revolutionary was its integration. Previous fire control computers, like the B-29's original General Electric system, used mechanical calculators with cam-driven mechanisms. These were limited by physical inertia, could not respond quickly to rapid target maneuvers, and suffered accuracy degradation at long ranges where small angular errors created large misdistances. The AN/APG-15B replaced mechanical computation with electronic calculation, replacing physical cams with voltage levels and replacing optical ranging with radar measurement. The result was a system that could track and engage targets moving twice as fast at twice the distance. Colonel Richard Carmichael, who had briefed General LeMay 6 months earlier, understood the strategic implications. Dr. Pound, you're telling us that this system makes our 1945 bomber competitive with 1950 jet fighters. Not competitive, Colonel. Survivable. The B-29 will never outrun or outclimb a MiG-15, but equipped with radar fire control, it can engage jets at ranges where the jets cannot effectively return fire. A MiG attacking from 2,000 yards faces defensive fire before reaching its own optimal firing range of 800 yards. The psychological effect alone changes the tactical equation. Production statistics supported rapid deployment. Western Electric's Kearney plant, operating 3 shifts, had increased AN/APG-15B output to 140 units monthly by December 1950. Each system cost $18,500, expensive but affordable compared to losing $600,000 bombers. By year's end, 78 B-29s in theatre had received the upgrade, with the remaining aircraft scheduled for modification by January 15, 1951. The unglamorous miracle of vacuum tubes and radar pulses was rewriting the mathematics of aerial combat. American electronics industry advantages, built on decades of commercial radio and radar development, had produced a weapon system that extended the service life of obsolete bombers by making them lethal to jets designed to destroy them. In Korea, Soviet and Chinese pilots were learning this lesson repeatedly. The fat American bombers they had expected to slaughter were shooting back with accuracy that defied explanation. The hunters were becoming the hunted. January 23, 1951. Kadena Air Base, Okinawa. The intelligence debriefing room was packed with crew members from the 307th Bombardment Wing, all of them survivors of what had become known as Black Tuesday. 12 B-29s had been attacked by 36 MiG-15 during a daylight raid on the Sinuiju railroad bridges. The upgraded bombers had shot down 4 MiGs confirmed, damaged 7 more, and lost only 1 aircraft to jet fighters. Captain Samuel Moran, Operations Intelligence Officer, studied the gun camera footage with quiet satisfaction. Frame by frame, the film showed what had been impossible just 3 months earlier. B-29 tail gunners engaging MiG-15 jets at ranges exceeding 1,800 yards, tracers converging on silver silhouettes that exploded or trailed smoke. "Gentlemen, the numbers tell the story," Moran began, projecting statistics onto the briefing room screen. From November 1950 through January 1951, B-29s equipped with AN/APG-15B radar fire control have been attacked 247 times by MiG-15 fighters. Results: 27 MiGs confirmed destroyed, 43 damaged, 14 B-29s lost to jet fighters. That's a loss exchange ratio of 1.9 to 1 in our favor. The comparison to pre-upgrade operations was stark. In the 3 weeks before radar systems were installed, November 1st to 22nd, 1950, MiG-15s had destroyed 11 B-29s while losing only 2 jets to defensive fire, a loss ratio of 5.5 to 1 against the bombers. The AN/APG-15B had reversed the mathematics of survival. Staff Sergeant Howard Tanner, whose November 9th kill had been the program's first success, raised his hand. "Sir, what are the Soviets saying about this? Do they know we have radar?" Moran consulted classified documents from Signals Intelligence Intercepts. SIGINT suggests they figured it out by mid-November. Intercepted communications between Soviet ground controllers and MiG pilots show confusion about B-29 defensive capabilities, followed by tactical changes. Soviet doctrine now emphasizes high-speed slashing attacks from multiple directions, trying to saturate our defensive fire. They're also increasing engagement ranges, approaching from 3,000 yards instead of 2,500. What Moran couldn't reveal, what remained classified top secret, was that American cryptographers had decrypted Soviet Air Force communications detailing their assessment of the upgraded B-29s. A November 28, 1950 message from Colonel Ivan Kozhedub to Soviet Air Defense Command headquarters in Moscow, now available in declassified NSA files, stated, "American heavy bombers have been equipped with what appears to be radar-directed defensive armament. Engagement ranges have increased to 2,000 meters. Previous tactical doctrine is no longer viable. Recommend development of countermeasures and revision of attack profiles." Soviet pilots confirmed this assessment in post-war interviews. Captain Nikolai Sutyagin, who had ejected from his damaged MiG on November 9th, recalled in his 1992 memoir, "After my first encounter with the upgraded B-29s, I knew something fundamental had changed. The Americans were shooting with a precision that suggested automatic computation. Our intelligence officers initially dismissed this as excuse-making by pilots who had performed poorly. But after multiple incidents with similar reports, they acknowledged the Americans had deployed new technology." Chinese pilots flying MiG-15 reported identical experiences. Senior Colonel Wang Hai, commander of the 9th Fighter Division and one of China's top aces with 9 confirmed victories, described encountering radar-equipped B-29s in his 2005 autobiography. "We called them the bombers with long teeth. They could bite us from distances we thought were safe. Many of our best pilots were damaged or shot down before they could reach effective firing range. We learned to respect these aircraft, despite their age and apparent obsolescence. The tactical impact extended beyond kill ratios. Soviet and Chinese fighter units became increasingly reluctant to press attacks against B-29 formations. Intelligence analysts noted that MiG interception rates declined from 89% in early November to 34% by January 1951. When jets did attack, they broke off earlier, fired from greater distances, and avoided the prolonged tail chases that had characterized early engagements. By February 1951, Far East Air Forces faced a different problem. The upgraded B-29s were so effective defensively that Strategic Air Command wanted to shift them from daylight to night operations, where their radar systems provided additional advantages. The AN/APG-15B could track targets in complete darkness, turning night into day for defensive gunners. Lieutenant General George Stratemeyer, commanding Far East Air Forces, made the decision on February 15th. Daylight strategic bombing will continue, but with reduced frequency. B-29s will increasingly operate at night, using radar fire control systems for both navigation and defense. The jets can't see us in the dark, but we can see them. The statistics from March through July 1951 validated this approach. Night operations saw B-29 loss rates drop to 0.4% per sortie, while MiG losses to bomber defensive fire remained steady at approximately 2 per month. The Superfortress, obsolete by daylight, became dominant at night. Soviet archives, declassified in the 1990s, revealed their frustration. A March 1951 intelligence summary from the Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps stated, "American B-29 bombers operating at night cannot be effectively intercepted without airborne radar systems, which our MiG-15 fighters lack. Defensive fire from bombers remains accurate despite darkness, suggesting radar-directed weapons. Losses during night interception attempts are unacceptable." The final accounting of B-29 versus MiG-15 engagements would take decades to compile accurately. American sources credited B-29 gunners with 27 confirmed MiG-15 kills, 33 probables, and 68 damaged. Soviet and Chinese records, released gradually after the Cold War, largely confirmed these numbers, though with typical discrepancies about what constituted a kill versus damaged. What remained indisputable was that the AN/APG-15B radar fire control system had accomplished its mission, transforming a vulnerable 1945 bomber into a survivable 1951 weapons platform. The system hadn't made the B-29 superior to jet fighters, but it had made the bomber lethal enough that jets could no longer attack with impunity. May 1985, Honolulu, Hawaii. The Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion brought together men who had tried to kill each other 34 years earlier. In a conference room at the Hilton Hawaiian Village, former B-29 tail gunner Howard Tanner, now 63 years old, sat across from retired Soviet Air Force Colonel Yevgeny Pepelyayev, who had claimed 19 victories flying MiG-15s over Korea. The translator, a young Air Force officer, struggled to keep up as the two veterans compared notes. What emerged was a picture of technological transformation seen from both sides of the engagement envelope. "The first time I encountered your radar system," Pepelyayev said through the translator, "was December 2, 1950, near Sinuiju. I attacked a formation of 6 B-29s from above and behind, standard approach. At 2,500 meters, I expected to close unopposed until 800 meters. Instead, tracers appeared immediately, perfectly aimed. I had to break off without firing." Tanner nodded. "We could see you on radar before you were visible to the naked eye. The system tracked you automatically. All I had to do was keep you centered on the scope and press the trigger when the range closed to 2,000 yards. This was shocking to us," Pepelyayev continued. "Our intelligence had told us American bombers were defenseless at long range. We expected easy victories. Instead, we found ourselves being shot at from distances we thought were safe. Many pilots refused to believe it was radar. They thought you had exceptional gunners with superhuman eyesight." The psychological impact had been profound. Captain Nikolai Sutyagin, present at the same reunion, described his November 9th encounter with Tanner's B-29. "When I was hit at 2,000 meters, before I could even establish a proper firing solution, I thought I had made a tactical error. Only later, after multiple pilots reported similar experiences, did we understand you had developed a technical advantage." Chinese pilots told similar stories. Colonel Zhao Baotong, attending as part of the Chinese delegation, recalled his first encounter with radar-equipped B-29s. "We called them ghost shooters because they could hit us when we could barely see them. Our training had emphasized closing to 800 meters for effective cannon fire. But the Americans were destroying aircraft at double that range. We had to completely revise our tactics." The American gunners' perspective revealed the transformation from their side. Technical Sergeant Robert Cruz, who had shot down a MiG on November 9th, described the system's impact. "Before the radar, we were guessing. Optical sights required you to estimate range, estimate speed, calculate lead mentally. Against jets moving at 500 miles per hour, it was nearly impossible. The radar did all the calculating. We just aimed where it told us to aim." Staff Sergeant James McCloskey added, "The confidence factor was huge. Previously, when MiGs attacked, We knew we were probably going to take hits before we could return effective fire. With radar, we could engage them first. That psychological advantage was as important as the technical advantage. Soviet engineering officers had studied crashed B-29s to understand the system. Colonel Pavel Suchoi, a post-war aviation technology assessor, explained, "We recovered wreckage from several B-29s shot down in early 1951. The radar equipment was badly damaged, but we could identify the basic components. What impressed us was the miniaturization. The entire system, radar, computer and display, fit into the tail section. We had similar technology, but only in ground-based installations or large interceptor aircraft. The Americans had miniaturized it for defensive use. The Soviet response had been characteristically direct. If they couldn't match American electronics, they would change tactics." By spring 1951, MiG pilots were using high-speed diving attacks from multiple directions, attempting to saturate defensive fire. They increased their approach speeds to 650 miles per hour, reducing exposure time in the B-29's engagement envelope. They also began using clouds and terrain masking to approach without being tracked on radar. "We learned to respect the B-29, Pepelyayev admitted. Not because it was a superior aircraft, it clearly wasn't, but because it was dangerous. A bomber that could shoot back accurately at 2,000 meters was not a helpless target. It was a threat." The statistics bore this out. From November 1950 through July 1953, when the armistice was signed, radar-equipped B-29s flew 20,369 combat sorties. MiG-15S destroyed 34 B-29s in aerial combat, a loss rate of 0.17%. In return, B-29 gunners claimed 33 confirmed MiG-15 kills and 78 damaged. The loss exchange ratio had shifted decisively in the bombers' favor. American veterans at the reunion expressed surprise that Soviet pilots had taken the threat so seriously. "We were flying a World War II bomber," Tanner noted. "We assumed you guys in jets would just blow through us. The radar gave us a fighting chance, but I never thought we'd actually scare you." "You didn't scare us," Pepelyayev replied with a slight smile. "You killed enough of us that we learned caution. There is a difference.